We saw in the previous slide how the distribution of disposable income was less unequal than the distribution of market income. In other words, the system of taxes and transfers of cash that governments have reduces the amount of income inequality. Let's look in a little bit more detail at just how that works. First thing we can think about are taxes. Very often when people think of taxes, they think of the income tax. But of course, there's plenty of other taxes. There's the harmonized sales tax, or HST. People pay property taxes. There are taxes on gasoline, cigarettes, variety of other kinds of taxes, which people pay. And if we look and see how those taxes compare with people's incomes, it's really only the income tax that is progressive, in the sense that people pay a larger share of their income in tax with the income tax, and therefore it tends to reduce income inequality. So in other words, people with relatively high incomes pay a greater percentage of their income in tax. People with lower incomes pay a lower percentage of their income in tax. And so that tends to reduce income inequality. When you consider all of the other taxes taken together, economists think, tend to be roughly proportional to income. So they don't really do very much to redistribute income. Really, most of the redistribution takes place in the form of transfers of cash, which, if we think about what those transfers are, tend to be received by lower income households rather than higher income households. So let's just run through the transfers of cash that exist in the Canadian system. Well, we've got pensions, public pensions. Old age security is something that is paid to everyone, although people with higher incomes have to pay some of that back. The guaranteed income supplement is an amount which is paid to elderly people who have otherwise very low incomes. So it's been very important in reducing poverty among elderly people. There's also the Canada Pension Plan. So the Canada Pension Plan is funded by a tax which is collected on people's wages, at least up to a certain level. So that also supplements people's incomes, but only if you've contributed to it. Provincial governments offer social assistance to people who otherwise have no source of income and who have very, very little in the way of assets. People who are unemployed get employment insurance payments. The Canada Child Benefit has been important as well in reducing poverty. So that's been increased and will continue to increase with the goal of eventually eliminating child poverty in Canada. And as well, some of you may be receiving GST tax credits. So the GST is the federal part of the harmonized sales tax. It stands for Goods and Services Tax. And so people with relatively low incomes get a payment every 3 months. So these transfers of cash are received disproportionately by lower income households. So they're going to be quite important in reducing inequality. Now, it's very important to note that there are other kinds of transfers that are not included in these measures that I'm showing you. So those are called transfers in kind. So a transfer in kind means that instead of giving somebody cash to go buy whatever they want to buy, you give them free health care instead. So you could imagine that that's kind of equivalent to giving people the money that the health care costs. So that's really obviously a very important transfer. Think about free education. If we were to compare different countries, which I will do in a few minutes, we could recognize that different countries have different levels of transfers in kind. So, for example, in some countries, you can have universal free daycare. You can have universal free university education and just post-secondary education in general. So these kinds of transfers don't get included when we're comparing how equal or unequal various countries are using the Gini coefficient. Well, let's just look at the Gini coefficient in Canada and the Lorentz curve once we adjust for the effect of taxes and transfers. So this solid line shows us the distribution of market income that we saw before, and that led to a Gini coefficient of 0.44. Once we include the effect of taxes and cash transfers, you can see that the Lorentz curve moves towards this line of equality, and so the difference between that line of equality and the Lorentz curve shrinks. So when you measure it, it turns out that the Gini coefficient is 0.31. What does that mean? That's saying that this area here is almost a third of this total area here. That's, as you should recall, is how the Gini coefficient is measured. It's just this area here compared to the entire area under this diagonal. So we can see that the tax and transfer system significantly reduces income inequality in Canada. How does Canada compare to other countries? Well, here's a graph that I found dating from the late 2000s, so in other words, around 2009 or so. But these things don't really change very much from year to year. Not surprisingly, the United States is the most unequal of these countries. And there's a group of countries, Canada included, which have relatively high income inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient compared to a number of countries in Europe. These ones that are, by these particular researchers, given a grade of A, Canada gets a C. So they're the usual suspects. The Scandinavian countries, Austria, Belgium. Here's the Netherlands here, which we saw earlier when we looked at the measurement of girls' heights. So the point of this is just to say that the degree of income inequality varies quite a lot between countries. And that income inequality is to a significant extent a political decision, because that's going to influence two things. It'll influence the amount of redistribution that takes place through taxes and transfers, but it's also going to influence the distribution of market incomes, for example. So you'll recall that in Chapter 9, the chapter on labor markets, we looked at the extent to which there were unions in different countries and the extent to which the power of workers as compared with the power of employers differed. And so in these countries here, the distribution of income is going to tend to be more equal even before taxes, just because workers are relatively more powerful compared to employers than is the case, say, at the other extreme here, if we think of the UK or the US. All right, well, how has income inequality been changing in Canada? We can measure that using the Gini coefficient, and it's very important that we compare market incomes with after-tax incomes. This word adjusted here, by the way, means that when we're looking at incomes, we're adjusting for family size. So this is based on household incomes, but you want to recognize the fact that the number of people in the family matters. So the more people there are in the family, the more they're going to have to spend just to maintain a certain standard of living. Well, what we can see, going back to the mid-1970s, if we just look at market income, we can see that the Gini coefficient started out sort of midway between 0.35 and 0.4, and it kind of gradually crept up. So here it's around 0.4, and then it creeps up to around 0.45 and is just now slightly below that. So there's been, over this long period of time, a gradual upward creep in inequality in market incomes. Now, the interesting thing is that if we look at after-tax incomes, we can see that even though market incomes were getting more unequal, after-tax incomes were not. So for a long time, at least up to the mid-1990s, the tax and transfer system was sort of acting to offset that increase in market income inequality. Then in the mid-1990s, there were some actions taken by the federal government, weakening unemployment insurance, for example, carrying out a variety of other measures which allowed after-tax income inequality to increase slightly. So that's really the Canadian story. Well, what can we say about why that increased inequality in market incomes has occurred? There's a variety of factors that probably lie behind this, and which ones are stronger is really difficult to say. Economists, however, have some ideas, and some of them we've seen already. One of them is globalization, increased import competition. So we saw arguments that would say that increased import competition, particularly from low-income countries, could press down the wages of the least skilled workers, and that would tend to increase income inequality. I showed you data that showed a decrease in the amount of unionization, so a smaller percentage of the workforce being unionized. Now, not only does that reduce workers' bargaining power, but it's also a fact that within unionized workplaces, wages are what economists call kind of compressed. So there's less wage inequality than there would tend to be in non-unionized workplaces. Another issue is technological change, which allows employers to substitute certain kinds of work for perhaps machines. So things could be automated, for instance. And it could also be that technological change changes the demand for certain kinds of labor. So if highly skilled labor sees an increase in demand, then wages and incomes and salaries at the top will tend to increase. I will shortly show you some data about how the top 1% have seen a very large share in, or a very large increase in their share of total incomes. And there's a lot of debate about exactly why that's happened. I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. One thing that I think your text also talks about in the American context is the growing political power of the wealthy, which kind of comes along with an increase in their share of total incomes. So in the next set of slides, I'm going to show you estimates of how the share of top incomes have gone up in recent decades.